80 years beneath the South Atlantic, a German submarine sat sealed in near-freezing darkness, her hatches corroded shut, her secrets apparently lost forever. Then, a remotely operated vehicle descended through the black water, forced open a pressure hatch that had not moved since 1945, and the cameras found something that should not have been there. Charts, detailed navigational maps of the Antarctic coastline. Stamped across the cover of the primary document case, the personal cipher of the man the Allies called the Desert Fox. The submarine was not supposed to be there. The search had begun with a German Naval Archive document recovered in Hamburg in 2019. A logistics manifest, partially water-damaged, referenced a Type 9C long-range U-boat designated for a special mission in the final weeks of the European War. The manifest listed the submarine's last known heading, south-southwest, into the open Atlantic, away from the collapsing Reich, away from the surrendering fleet, away from everything. A joint team of German and Norwegian marine archaeologists spent 3 years cross-referencing the manifest against Allied intercept records, shipping lane data from 1945 and acoustic detection logs from British naval stations that had monitored the South Atlantic during the final months of the war. The acoustic signatures were still there in the archive. A submarine running deep, running fast, running in the wrong direction for anything the official record could explain. In the austral summer of 2023, the research vessel positioned itself over the coordinates the acoustic data suggested. 2 autonomous underwater vehicles descended first, sweeping the seabed with side-scan sonar, hunting for the distinctive shape of a warship hull among decades of sedimentation. What the sonar returned stopped the team cold. The submarine lay at 470 meters, resting at a slight angle on her port side. She was largely intact. The pressure hull had held. The conning tower was still standing. Decades of sediment had built up along her lower sections, partially burying the bow, but the identification numbers stenciled on the conning tower were legible through the cameras of the remotely operated vehicle that descended 2 days later. The number confirmed what the archive document had suggested. This was not a combat vessel lost in battle. There were no visible torpedo strikes, no blast damage, no sign of the violence that had sent so many of her sister ships to the bottom. The hatches were sealed from the inside. She had been scuttled deliberately. Someone had opened the vents, let the ocean in, and gone down with her. Or they had not gone down at all. The escape hatch showed evidence of having been opened and resealed, which meant that at some point before she hit the bottom, someone had left. The remotely operated vehicle spent 11 days working the wreck before the team attempted entry. The exterior was documented in extraordinary detail. Every weld, every hull plate, every external fitting was photographed and mapped into a 3-dimensional model that researchers would spend months analyzing. When they finally cut through the corroded seal on the forward access hatch and fed a camera into the interior, what they found was preservation that defied expectation. Cold water at depth is a remarkable preservative. The interior of the submarine had flooded completely, but the temperature had barely risen above 2 degrees since the day she went down. Organic materials had survived in forms that would have been impossible in warmer water. Paper was fragile, but readable. Fabric had decayed, but retained structure. And, in the captain's chart room, sealed inside a zinc-lined document case that had been bolted to the bulkhead, the maps were waiting. Naval historians who reviewed the initial footage described their reaction in almost identical terms. Disbelief, followed by something they struggled to name. The maps showed a coastline that no German submarine was supposed to have any reason to chart. The cipher stamp on the document case belonged to a man who had been dead since 1944. Erwin Rommel never commanded a submarine. That needs to be stated plainly, because the story that follows is complicated enough without allowing the legend to overwhelm the evidence. Rommel was a land general, one of the finest tactical commanders of the Second World War on either side. He led the 7th Panzer Division through France in 1940 with a speed that left Allied commanders struggling to understand what had just happened to them. He was given command of the Africa Corps in 1941 and spent the next 2 years conducting a campaign across the Libyan and Egyptian deserts that earned him a reputation that crossed enemy lines. British soldiers called him the Desert Fox. Churchill mentioned him admiringly in the House of Commons. His own men believed he was simply incapable of being outmaneuvered. He was wrong, eventually. The logistics that had always haunted the Africa Corps finally caught up with him at El Alamein in 1942. Montgomery had supplies, air cover, and time. Rommel had none of these things. The desert campaign ended. Rommel went back to Europe. By 1944, he was commanding Army Group B in France, responsible for the defense of the Atlantic Wall against the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. He disagreed violently with Hitler about how to deploy the Panzer reserves. He lost the argument. On July 17, 1944, his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft on a French road. Rommel was gravely wounded. He never returned to command. 3 months later, in October 1944, he was dead, implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler. Given the choice between a public trial and a private suicide, he chose the cyanide capsule. The Nazi government announced he had died of his wounds. He was given a state funeral. That is the official record. What the document case recovered from the submarine suggests is that Rommel, in the weeks before his death, had been involved in something that the Nazi high command wanted buried at least as deeply as the man himself. His personal cipher appears on the document case not as a signature, but as an authorization code. This was a classification system used by the German military for documents that required senior officer authorization to move. Rommel's cipher had been used to authorize the sealed transfer of the charts to this specific submarine. The authorization is dated September 1944, 3 weeks before he died. Naval historians have noted that the use of a senior land commander's cipher to authorize naval documents is highly irregular. It suggests either that Rommel had direct knowledge of whatever operation this submarine was undertaking, or that his cipher was being used by someone else to provide cover for a mission that needed to be distanced from the naval command structure. Either interpretation is disturbing. The first implies that one of Germany's most celebrated generals was connected to a clandestine operation in the final months of the war that no official record has ever acknowledged. The second implies that his cipher was being used without his knowledge or after his death, which raises questions about who within the Nazi hierarchy had access to it and why they needed it. The maps offer no answer to these questions, but they point toward a place where someone believed the answers could be found. To understand what this submarine was doing in the South Atlantic, you have to understand what Germany's U-boat fleet was doing in the final months of the war. And the picture that emerges from the naval archives is not the one that history textbooks typically describe. The official story of the U-boat war ends roughly in 1943, when Allied anti-submarine warfare finally broke the back of the German campaign in the Atlantic. That is accurate as far as it goes. The wolf packs were destroyed. The tonnage war was lost. U-boat crews began dying faster than they could be replaced, and the submarines that still operated did so in a climate of near certain death. But a separate category of U-boat operations continued right up until the German surrender in May 1945, and these missions looked nothing like the convoy attacks that defined the Battle of the Atlantic. The Monsoon Group has already demonstrated what Germany was capable of when strategic necessity required it. Long-range submarines running to Japan, carrying uranium, mercury, technical drawings, weapons components, and specialist personnel. These were not combat patrols. They were supply missions, technology transfers, and in some cases, evacuation operations. The men running them were not hunting ships. They were moving things. The pattern of these missions accelerated dramatically in the final 12 months of the war. As the Reich contracted, as Allied armies closed in from east and west, a category of submarine operation emerged that the official German naval records document only obliquely and incompletely. These missions were authorized at the highest levels, their destinations encoded, their cargoes listed in manifests that use terminology designed to obscure rather than describe. At least 11 Type 9C and Type 10B submarines were dispatched on missions described in the naval logs as Sonderaufgabe, special tasks. Their destinations were recorded as classified. Several of them were never accounted for in the post-war reckoning. They did not surrender. They did not appear in the Deadlight Fleet. They did not show up in neutral ports. They simply disappeared from the record. For decades, historians assumed these submarines had been lost at sea. The South Atlantic and the waters around South America were vast, dangerous, and not extensively monitored. A submarine running deep and maintaining radio silence could travel enormous distances without detection. The assumption was that something had gone wrong, that they had been sunk by storms, by mechanical failure, by 1,000 ways a submarine can die in the open ocean without anyone knowing. The submarine recovered in 2023 offers a different possibility. It did not sink by accident. It was scuttled deliberately by a crew that appears to have known exactly what they were doing and why. The question is not what went wrong. The question is what went right and what they were protecting. The document case contained 11 separate charts. 7 of them were standard German naval navigational maps of the South Atlantic, the type any long-range submarine would carry for an extended mission. 4 of them were different. These 4 charts depicted the Antarctic coastline in detail that should not have existed in 1944. The Antarctic continent had been explored intermittently since the early 19th century, but comprehensive coastal mapping was still incomplete by the time the Second World War began. What charts existed were imprecise, based on observations from ships that had never penetrated far into the pack ice. The level of detail on the 4 documents recovered from this submarine was inconsistent with anything available through official German cartographic sources in that period. Naval historians who examined high-resolution scans of the charts spent considerable time trying to identify the source of the underlying data. The coastal profiles, the depth soundings, the notations about ice conditions and prevailing currents all suggested first-hand observation rather than compilation from existing sources. Someone had been there. Someone had recorded what they saw with precision. And someone had incorporated that data into charts that ended up in a sealed document case on a submarine that was supposed to have no reason to be anywhere near Antarctica. The charts focused on a specific section of the Antarctic coastline, the region known as Queen Maud Land, which Norwegian explorers had named in 1930 after their monarch. What almost no one outside specialist circles knew in 1939 was that Germany had conducted its own Antarctic expedition in that same region between January and February of that year, just months before the war began. The German Antarctic expedition of 1938 to 1939 had been organized with unusual urgency and given resources that, in retrospect, seemed disproportionate to its stated scientific purpose. The expedition ship, the Schwabenland, had launched aircraft that flew systematic survey missions over 600,000 square kilometers of the Antarctic interior. The Germans renamed the territory Neuschwabenland and filed a formal territorial claim. Then, the war started. The expedition records went into classified storage. The territorial claim was quietly set aside, and the Antarctic, as far as the public record was concerned, ceased to be a German interest. The charts recovered from the submarine show something the 1939 expedition records do not. In the margin of the largest chart, in handwriting that analysts have matched to German naval cartographic notation of the period, there are coordinate references for 7 specific locations along the coast. Each location is marked with a small symbol, The symbol is the same at all 7 locations. It is a stylized representation of a submarine. The notations beside 3 of these symbols include depth measurements, current data, and what appear to be supply inventory figures. The figures reference fuel quantities, food stores, and a category listed simply as Ausrüstung and equipment. Naval architects who reviewed the charts noted that the coastal locations marked by the submarine symbols correspond to areas where icy shelves create natural overhangs above the waterline, features that could potentially conceal structures or vessels from aerial observation. The depth readings match what modern bathymetric surveys have confirmed for those locations. 2 of the 7 marked locations have never been the subject of any documented post-war expedition. What, if anything, remains at those coordinates has never been systematically investigated. In August 1946, less than 18 months after Germany surrendered, the United States Navy launched the largest Antarctic expedition in history. Operation High Jump was commanded by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, the most celebrated polar explorer in American history. It deployed 4,700 men, 13 ships including an aircraft carrier, and 33 aircraft. Its official stated purpose was to train personnel and test equipment in polar conditions, and to consolidate and extend American sovereignty over the Antarctic. This explanation has never satisfied historians. 4,700 men and an aircraft carrier is not a training exercise. The scale was extraordinary by any measure, and the urgency was more extraordinary still. The expedition was organized and dispatched with a speed that left the scientific community struggling to participate. Researchers who had been planning Antarctic work for years found themselves scrambling to attach themselves to a military operation that was already moving. Byrd himself gave the expedition's purpose away, though not intentionally, in an interview he gave to a Chilean newspaper in March 1947 after returning from the ice. He spoke about the possibility of an enemy that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He described a potential threat that required urgent attention. The interview was widely dismissed at the time as the eccentric musings of an aging explorer who had spent too much time in the cold. But Byrd was not eccentric. He was one of the most methodical and scientifically rigorous explorers of his generation. He did not make careless statements to foreign journalists. And the region his expedition spent the most time surveying was not distributed evenly across the continent. The operation's aircraft flew the majority of their reconnaissance missions over Queen Maud Land, over Neuschwabenland, over exactly the region that appears on the charts recovered from the submarine. Operation High Jump was officially terminated early. The stated reason was deteriorating weather conditions. But the expedition had been planned for 8 months and was cut short after less than 3. Naval records indicate that several aircraft were lost during operations over the interior. The full reports from those missions remain classified under categories that were reviewed and maintained as recently as 2019. No official explanation has ever been offered for why the aerial survey data gathered during Operation High Jump was classified rather than published. No scientific findings from the expedition were ever fully released. The bathymetric and geological data collected by 13 ships operating for months in Antarctic waters would have been scientifically valuable under any circumstances. It was filed and sealed. Admiral Byrd died in 1957. His personal expedition journals were donated to the Ohio State University archives. Researchers who have reviewed them note that the entries covering specific dates during the Antarctic operation are missing. The pages have been removed. Not lost, not damaged. Removed. The gaps correspond to the dates of the deepest interior reconnaissance flights. What Byrd found or did not find remains officially unresolved. The charts from the submarine offer one possible reason for the urgency with which the Americans went looking. The submarine at 470 meters is beyond the reach of human divers. This was not a case where researchers could simply put on tanks and descend. The wreck required technology that did not exist a generation ago and has only recently become capable of the precision this investigation demanded. The autonomous underwater vehicles that conducted the initial survey represented the same class of technology that has transformed deep-sea archaeology over the past decade. Equipped with multi-beam sonar, capable of resolving details smaller than 2 centimeters at depth. These vehicles map the entire exterior of the submarine in 3 dimensions before any attempt was made to interact with the wreck. The resulting model was accurate to within millimeters across the entire hull length. This was not simply a precaution, it was a forensic necessity. The external condition of a wreck tells its own story, and that story needs to be captured completely before any intervention disturbs it. The way the hatches had sealed, the pattern of corrosion on the hull plates, the sediment accumulation profiles around the submarine's contact points with the seabed, all of this was evidence. All of it needed to be recorded before anyone touched anything. The water temperature at that depth had been a critical factor in preservation. The South Atlantic at 470 meters maintains temperatures between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius year-round. At these temperatures, bacterial decomposition slows to almost nothing. Organic materials that would have decayed completely in warmer water had survived. The paper in the document case was fragile, requiring careful handling, but it was structurally intact. The ink was readable. The charts were complete. The remotely operated vehicle used for interior access was equipped with manipulator arms capable of exerting precisely calibrated force. The team spent 3 days working the corroded hatch seal before it gave way. The approach was deliberate. Applying too much force risked damaging the interior space and destroying exactly the materials they had come to find. Once interior access was achieved, the cameras revealed conditions consistent with what the temperature data had predicted. 80 years of immersion had deposited a thin layer of biological material across most surfaces, but the underlying objects were largely intact. The document case was exactly where the captain's chart room would have placed it. Bolted to the bulkhead. Sealed. Waiting. Extraction required a custom-built cradle fabricated aboard the research vessel and lowered to the wreck site. The document case was removed from the bulkhead in a single operation and transported to the surface inside a sealed, water-filled container to prevent the sudden change in pressure and temperature from shocking materials that had been stable for decades. Conservators working on the research vessel spent 4 days stabilizing the documents before they could be safely examined. The AI-driven imaging systems used for initial analysis processed the document surfaces through multispectral photography that revealed details invisible to the human eye. Notations made in pencil over ink, erased but not gone. Marginal annotations added in a different hand. Coordinates that had been partially obscured were recovered by algorithms designed to reconstruct degraded text. Every layer of the documents told its own story, and the deeper the analysis went, the more layers there were to read. The forensic record from this investigation is substantial. It is also incomplete. Both of these things need to be stated with equal clarity, because the temptation to fill gaps with certainty is precisely the failure that has compromised the public understanding of historical mysteries before. What the evidence establishes beyond reasonable dispute is this. A German Type 9C submarine was operating in the South Atlantic in the final weeks of the European War. She was deliberately scuttled by a crew that sealed her hatches before opening her vents. Her document case contained navigational charts of the Antarctic coastline that incorporate survey data inconsistent with any publicly available German cartographic source from the period. Those charts include coordinate notations that correspond to natural coastal features capable of concealing maritime infrastructure. The document case was authorized for transport using the personal cipher of Erwin Rommel, applied 3 weeks before his death. These are facts. They are supported by physical evidence, archival cross-referencing, and expert analysis from multiple independent institutions. What the evidence cannot establish is this: whether any structure was ever built at the locations marked on the charts, whether Rommel personally authorized the document transfer, or whether his cipher was used by someone else, whether the crew who scuttled the submarine survived and reached land, what the specific mission of the submarine was, whether the maps represent plans that were executed or plans that were abandoned. These are unanswered questions. The distinction matters. because the gap between what the evidence shows and what it proves is exactly where speculation fills the void. Antarctica has attracted more than its share of theories that exceed their evidence base by extraordinary distances. The idea of a functioning Nazi base beneath the Antarctic ice, populated by escaped war criminals operating advanced technology decades after the Reich's defeat, belongs to a category of claim that requires proportionate evidence before it deserves serious engagement. That level of evidence is not present here. The charts are not that evidence. They are something more limited and more interesting. They are proof that someone within the Nazi hierarchy believed Antarctica was worth mapping in detail, worth reaching by submarine, and worth protecting with a level of classification that required a dead general's cipher to authorize. What they built there, if they built anything at all, is a question the charts cannot answer. Naval historians who have reviewed the full dataset are careful in their conclusions. The maps show intent. They show planning. They show a level of operational specificity that goes well beyond casual interest in a remote continent. Whether that intent was ever realized is a question that only the Antarctic itself can answer. And so far, no one with the resources to look has committed to looking in the right places. This submarine does not exist in isolation. That is the part of the story that the history textbooks have consistently failed to address, not because the evidence is absent, but because assembling it requires connecting dots across institutions, archives, and disciplines that rarely talk to each other. These are connections that matter. Start with what is confirmed. U-234 was captured in May 1945, carrying 560 kilograms of uranium oxide, jet aircraft components, V-2 rocket blueprints, and 2 Japanese officers who killed themselves rather than be captured. She was on a delivery mission to Japan. She was not unique. She was part of a program. The Monsoon Group conducted multiple supply runs between Germany and Japan through the Indian Ocean. These missions moved uranium, mercury, advanced optical equipment, technical personnel, and strategic metals. The boats that completed those runs and the boats that did not represent a documented pattern of Germany using submarines as strategic cargo vessels in the final phase of the war. Operation Deadlight sent 116 captured submarines to the bottom of the Atlantic with minimal inspection of their contents. The men running the operation were focused on disposal, not documentation. Several submarines on the Deadlight manifest have never been located. Their contents remain unknown. Their final positions were recorded as estimates. Now add the submarine recovered in 2023 to this picture. A long-range U-boat operating under classified orders carried charts that show detailed Antarctic survey data and coordinate specific notations suggesting infrastructure, authorized by the cipher of a senior commander whose connection to naval operations in that period has never been examined. She was not heading for Japan. She was not heading for South America, which is where the submarines that actually did carry escaping Nazis went and which are documented in post-war records. She was heading somewhere that required her to be scuttled rather than surrendered, and somewhere that her crew apparently expected to reach by methods other than the submarine itself. The escape hatch evidence is not conclusive, but it is consistent with a crew that had a destination. The pattern that emerges across these separate pieces of evidence is not a conspiracy theory. It is a logistics picture. Germany in the final months of the war was moving things. Nuclear materials, advanced technology, strategic resources, and in some cases, people. The submarines were the only vessels capable of making those movements without interception. The destinations were chosen for their inaccessibility and their distance from Allied monitoring. Antarctica was the most inaccessible place on Earth in 1944. It still largely is. The German expedition of 1938 to 1939 had already established that Queen Maud Land contained features suitable for concealment. The 1939 expedition's classified records have never been fully released by the German government. The aerial survey data from those flights, covering 600,000 square kilometers, has been publicly available only in summary form. Operation High Jump happened for a reason. 4,700 men and an aircraft carrier do not deploy to a remote continent on the basis of a training exercise. Byrd's interview comments about a threat capable of traveling between poles at extraordinary speeds have been dismissed for 75 years as either confusion or embellishment. The charts from this submarine offer a context in which those comments become harder to dismiss. The iceberg did not sink the Titanic alone. The rivets did. The coal fire did. The outdated regulations did. The comfortable decisions made by men in boardrooms who would never face consequences for them. By the same measure, the collapse of the Third Reich did not simply end with a signature in a railway carriage in May 1945. It ended messily, incomplete, with materials and people and plans that were moving in directions the official record only partially captured. The submarine at 470 meters is one piece of that incomplete ending. The Antarctic coastline it was navigating toward may be another. Nobody has gone to look, and nobody with the resources to conduct a systematic search of the locations marked on those charts has committed to doing so. The political complications are obvious. The ice is deep. The continent is protected by international treaty. The cost would be substantial, and the answers, if they exist, would require a reckoning with a history that several governments have spent 80 years carefully managing. So, the maps sit in a conservation facility. The coordinates are known. The locations exist. Somewhere beneath the Antarctic ice, in natural coastal recesses, that a 1939 aerial survey found, and that a 1944 submarine was apparently navigating toward whatever was placed there, if anything was placed there, continues to wait. The submarine remains at 470 meters. Researchers recovered the document case, the charts, and several additional artifacts from the captain's quarters. The majority of the interior has not been accessed. The forward torpedo room is sealed by internal flooding damage, and it is inaccessible without interventions the current team has not attempted. The engineering spaces have not been entered. The cargo hold, which in a Type 9C submarine was substantial, has not been examined. Whatever else this submarine was carrying when she went down is still there. The site has been designated for protected status under the terms of the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage. This means further intervention requires international authorization, an environmental impact assessment, and coordination between multiple national agencies. It does not mean it will happen quickly. The men who went down with this submarine, if any did, have been there for 80 years. The wreck is their grave as much as it is a crime scene. The researchers who mapped it understand this. Every expedition to a wreck of this kind carries with it the weight of the dead, the obligation to treat what you find as testimony rather than treasure. But the testimony this submarine offers has not been fully heard. The charts have been analyzed. The cipher has been identified. The pattern of the mission has been partially reconstructed. The questions that remain are not small ones, and the people who could have answered them are gone. What we know is this: in the final weeks of the most destructive war in human history, someone within the Nazi hierarchy considered Antarctica important enough to send a submarine there, important enough to authorize the mission with a dead general's cipher, important enough to design the mission around concealment rather than return. The iceberg pulled the trigger on the Titanic. The rivets and the fire and the outdated lifeboats loaded the gun. The Bismarck fired the shells that killed the Hood. But the decisions that made those shells fatal were made in shipyards and admiralties years before. In the same way, whatever lies at the coordinates marked on those charts was not placed there by accident or impulse. It was planned, resourced, and executed by an institution that was simultaneously collapsing and trying to survive its own collapse. What they were trying to preserve, and whether any of it survived, remains the question that the ocean floor has not yet finished answering. The wreck kept her secrets for 80 years. The technology has finally arrived to hear what she has to say. We have only heard the first sentence.